Owning a boat comes with a number of perks, like being able to fling your favorite fishing rod around. And here's another perk. Geico's boat insurance covers your boat and your belongings. And with specialist support from agents that are as passionate about boating as you are, there's so much value that you'll want to high-five someone. But not while you're holding your fishing rod. That's a prized possession. So hold on tight with both hands and keep it covered through boat insurance. Get more with Geico.
3, 2, 1.
This podcast contains content that may be disturbing for some listeners and is intended for a mature audience. Listener discretion is advised.
This is the story from the case files of attorney Patrick Haynes. In his early career as a criminal defense attorney, he was appointed as a legal representative for a ruthless ringleader of a prolific poaching organization. This story is 100% real life and happened in central and southeast lower Michigan in the late 1970s. It changed the lives of countless people and quite literally destroyed the lives of others. The former director of the Michigan Department of Natural Resources, Dr. Howard Tanner, called this the most significant crackdown on commercialized market hunters in American history. I am Tracy Anderson, and this is Unusual Curiosity. Pat, how long did this investigation take, and how many people were involved?
A 2-year investigation that happened that ended up involving, at the end, 170 law enforcement officers that were made up of state, local, federal, and sheriff deputies, as well as 125 DNR agents that were located in 40 places across the southern part of the state, executed a coordinated raid early in the morning and arrested 54 people within a couple of hours across Michigan. 6 of those 54 people included the owners of various meat markets down in the Detroit area.
What happened as a result of this case?
This was a criminal case that ended up helping to change poaching laws nationwide, as well as in Michigan.
We're going to get more into that later on in the story, but can you give us a little background on poaching?
Some background in history is probably a good thing to talk about. White-tailed deer are widely distributed across North America, and for at least 10,000 years, they have been important to human beings in the United States for food, clothing, and tools. Market hunting and habitat changes back in the 1800s caused a precipitous decline in the number of white-tailed deer in North America. The number of white-tailed deer in 1900 was all the way down to approximately 500,000 deer. That number has now risen to nearly 30 million as of the beginning of the 21st century. Today, white-tailed deer are the most popular big game animal in North America. Annually, approximately 10 million hunters harvest over 6 million white-tailed deer in the United States each year. That sounds like a staggering amount, but it really isn't. If you look at people who condemn hunting, what they tend to forget is that if we didn't remove 6 million white-tailed deer a year, we would be overrun with deer. They're everywhere. This exact same problem and situation exists for pheasants, squirrels, ducks, fish, really any type of wildlife. And so what caused the number of deer to go down so significantly and then to increase so dramatically? Why did pheasants almost cease to exist in Michigan? I think the story we're going to tell you is going to help explain that, because this wild game poaching ring literally was responsible for killing, harvesting, however you want to call it, thousands and thousands of deer, hundreds of thousands of raccoons, hundreds of thousands of rabbits and squirrels, tens of thousands of fish. There was just a huge amount of wild animals that were being killed and then marketed throughout southern Michigan in this story that we're about to tell you.
How did you end up getting involved?
I got involved because I received a call from a judge, John O'Brien, who was a district court judge in Mason, Michigan. I had been practicing law for about 3 years at that point in time, new young lawyer. But I had already developed a reputation that I was willing to stand up to virtually anybody. I've been described as a very aggressive lawyer. And Judge O'Brien knew that he needed somebody that was willing to literally go toe-to-toe with the Michigan Attorney General's office on a case such as this that involved literally 54 people that had been arrested. And the reason Judge O'Brien called me was he needed somebody to represent the ringleader of this poaching ring. And so I didn't know what I was getting into when I got the call. But the judge called, and I was honored to have him think of me. So I said, yeah.
So at this point, you're feeling pretty good about the situation. Where do we go from here?
So I sat down with my client, who was out on bail, and he started to tell me what was going on. And then I was going through literally about 600 pages of police reports and seeing what a big case this was. This was a case that in Michigan we have something called preliminary examinations, which is a hearing that usually is a half-day hearing, maybe a day hearing on a really big case, to determine whether or not a crime has been committed and whether or not there's reason to believe that the person that's charged with this crime committed the crime. A different standard than guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. It's just enough to be able to bind the person over, was what it's called, to trial. And this is a case where I sat in a courtroom for 6 days on a preliminary examination and learned a story that, frankly, I'll never forget.
What was your client, Thomas, for the sake of this podcast, we're going to call him Thomas, what was he charged with?
Well, he was charged with so many different counts in so many different courts that I believe he had a total, let me just double check. I think he had something like 30 different counts against him, mostly misdemeanors. But this was a case because the Michigan Attorney General's office and the Federal Department of Justice was involved, because these people were charged with violating both state wildlife laws and federal wildlife laws. And so both the feds and the state were involved. And I represented Tom in Ingham County, out in Mason. But he had cases in Jackson. He had cases in Livingston County. He had cases in Detroit. And he had cases in the federal courts in Detroit as well. And mine was the first that really started through the court system.
So Tom was charged with 30 counts in 1979. Is it fair to say that poaching laws are stricter now? And if this were happening in present day, would he be charged with more?
Back when this happened, there was a law that was in place that had been there for a long time, and it was poorly written, and it required very high standard of proof to be able to show that somebody had violated the wildlife laws. And because of this particular case and the things that happened over this case, it was recognized both on a state and federal level that these laws needed to change because it was too difficult to prosecute people. And so to answer your question directly, yeah, if the laws changed in 1980. All this case came to a head in 1979. So in 1980, there were major changes in federal law that would have, had those changes been in place back in before 1980, it would have changed lots of parts of this particular case.
How did Tom get involved in poaching?
So what happened was Tom recognized, he was from the South, and he recognized that there was a real market for wild game, particularly deer, ducks, pheasants, rabbits were huge, squirrels, and raccoons, which a lot of people don't even think of raccoons as being something somebody would eat.
Ugh, how do you eat a raccoon?
Very carefully, as they say. Raccoon is an interesting animal because it is a very rich meat, but raccoons have a very high fat content. And you need to know how to clean a raccoon before you even think of cooking it. You have to literally get all the fat off this raccoon before you start cooking it. And, but it is a very popular food among various ethnic groups. In fact, while we don't have exact numbers, it's probably likely that this ring, over the time of his existence, which was almost 10 years, was probably over 1 million raccoons that they harvested and sold in the markets in the Detroit area.
When you're talking about that many animals, how does that affect the ecosystem? I mean, was there a noticeable decline in certain types of animals during that time?
There was a noticeable decline in the number of deer. This ring poached tens of thousands of deer. Raccoons is hard to measure, very hard to measure. Raccoons are wanted for two different things. They're wanted for their fur and they're wanted for the meat. Rabbits, same way, although the meat's more important with rabbits than the pelt. But this particular ring also would take, in addition to deer, in addition to rabbits and raccoons, they would do muskrats, they would do possums, because what would happen in this ring, it was a real enterprise. In fact, I refer to this as the wildlife mafia because they were so well organized. They had hunters, they had taxidermists, they had butchers, they had people that sold the meat to customers. They had people that gathered. So if there were 8 hunters in that particular area, they would bring their game to another person who would bag it, freeze it, and then my guy, Thomas, was the one that would then drive around and pick up this meat that was all packaged and deliver it to the markets, where they would then sell it to the end customer.
You said about 10 years this whole thing went on. What year would you say he started this?
They believe the ring started, they being the Attorney General's office, started in about 1970 or 71. And it was kind of interesting because these people, if you've ever seen the movie Deliverance, you would think that some of these people in this ring were from the cast, could have been in the cast of Deliverance. Okay. They were a tough, mean group that all had regular jobs, but they used this as additional income. And they were very, very smart. They, in fact, were remarkable hunters, remarkable trappers. The DNR started getting reports, just random reports, that wild game was getting sold in the Detroit area. It was interesting because the people doing this in this ring were clever enough that the DNR couldn't really catch them. And it was also interesting because at one point, Detroit police officers stopped my guy, Thomas, who had a truck full, a pickup truck, full of deer, rabbits, and raccoons in the back.
Huge red flag.
Yes. They let him go. They didn't really care. They let him go. DNR was not happy that they let him go, but nevertheless they did. And I don't know the reason for sure, but I think it was because the people that they were policing down in the Detroit area were buying this meat at a price that was cheaper than in grocery stores. Actually, probably better for them than the meat that was sold in grocery stores. And my personal opinion is the police thought, okay, they're not hurting anybody.
Right.
But the police didn't have any clue how big this was.
Sure. He was kind of viewed maybe as a Robin Hood. He's bringing the stuff to the people that need it. And
I think there was some of that.
yeah.
Absolutely.
So give me a little background on Thomas. What kind of personality was he? Was he like a person that could gather the masses and get them to follow? What was he?
He was an interesting guy. His day job, actually it was a night job, he was a maintenance person for Henry Ford Hospital in Detroit. And in fact, he was fortunate enough that on the Henry Ford campus back then, they owned a number of houses that surrounded the hospital. And they allowed him to live in one of those houses as part of his pay. Well, as Henry Ford Hospital grew, they needed to tear down the house that Thomas was and his wife were living in. And Thomas thought, this is perfect. This is absolutely perfect that they're going to tear this house down, because he had some secrets in this house that he thought the demolition would take care of. And so he didn't have a problem with that. He said, okay, fine. And so he moved out of the house and the demo crew showed up. What Tom didn't know was that before they could tear down the house, the demolition crew had to go inside. So a crew of demolition people on a nice summer night, it's a nice summer afternoon actually, go into this house thinking we just need to check to make sure the gas is disconnected, the electricity is disconnected. And they made a discovery that probably is still in their minds today. What they discovered, they found a pile of pheasant heads. Just the heads, 4 feet high and 8 feet across. I have no idea how many thousands of pheasants that represents, but if you think of a pheasant and you think of the head, and it forms a pile that's 4 feet high and 8 feet across, you know there's a lot of pheasants.
They're about equivalent to the size of a chicken head, probably.
Right.
Was he butchering these in his house?
That's what they were doing. In fact, he got to a point where it was getting hard for him to get rid of things like the heads. The demolition crew went upstairs and found parts of almost 500 rabbits that were upstairs. And Tom thought, this is perfect. They're going to tear this down, put this whole house and my pheasant heads and the rabbits in the dumpster and take them to the dump, and nobody's going to be the wiser. But the demolition crew, after they got done gasping at what they saw, called the DNR. And the DNR came in and inspected. And that was the real tip-off of Tom being involved.
So what year was this?
That would have been in 1976. And so what happened was one of the DNR agents that was assigned to this situation that got the call from the demo crew decided that he would investigate. And he started following, literally, putting a tail, as they say, on Tom and watching what he was doing.
And Tom at this point had no idea what had happened. He's just going about his life like his garbage has been taken care of.
Yep. Totally fine.
And was his employer notified at this point because they had been the owner of the home? Were they ever involved or notified?
No, they never were. And the reason they weren't, and the reason, as we'll talk about a little bit later, is the hunting world's a pretty small world. Okay, and so it was critical that the DNR keep this under wraps. There were literally about 6 people in the entire DNR that were aware of what was going on. It turned out that that was a good decision because as time went on, found out that some of the people involved in the ring were relatives of conservation officers.
So at this point, Thomas is being tailed by the DNR, and there's only 6 people within the whole DNR office that are aware of what's going on at this point.
At the most, it might even been less than 6.
So where does it go from here?
As you noticed, I haven't used the last name of Tom, and I haven't, and I won't use the last name of anybody in this. Even though all of this information comes directly from the police reports that were part of the public record, I think it's just better not to use those names at this point. So there was a DNR agent by the name of Chuck B, we'll just use that for his last name, who became aware of this issue with all of the pheasant heads in the demolished house and decided he would start putting a tail on Thomas to find out what he was doing. Well, what he saw was that about 3 times a week, Tom was showing up at the Great Eastern Market in Detroit with a pickup truck full of wild game. And what they noticed was that part of this wild game were ducks. Well, ducks fall under federal protection as opposed to state protection. So they went to the feds and explained what appeared to be happening here was that there were trafficking wild ducks as well as the deer, the pheasants, the rabbits, et cetera, et cetera. And so together, the feds and the DNR decided they needed to put some people undercover. And since Chuck was the one that started tailing Thomas, got the feds involved. Rick L., who was the federal Fish and Wildlife Department, and Chuck B. went to the head of the DNR and said, we think there is a ring going on here with a lot of sales of wild animals, and they wanted to go undercover. Rick, who had been with the feds for a few years, and Chuck, who had been with the DNR for a number of years. Chuck had never been undercover before, and that's a different life for people. But he felt he could do that. And so he and Rick talked to the head of the DNR and asked if they could go undercover. And the head of the DNR said, sure, let's give that a try. So they started doing more surveillance. But then they realized now we're into 1977, that they were seeing a lot of activity, but 1977 was a really bad winter and a lot of snow. In fact, it was so bad that in certain counties in Michigan declared a national disaster because there was so much snow. As a result of being so much snow, people can't get out in the fields and hunt the deer, hunt the rabbits, and so on and so forth. So they actually put everything on hold because there was not enough movement of wild game because of the weather. They decided to pick this back up again, this investigation, the following year. Well, 1978 was even a worse winter than 1977, but it didn't seem to be affecting the poaching ring because they were finding ways to get their wild game despite the snow. Like I said, these were really organized people. They knew what they were doing. And so these two went undercover. The primary undercover person was Chuck B., who was with the DNR conservation officer. It was decided between he and Rick, the Fed, that the best way to do it was for Chuck to take on the role of being a trapper. So he became a trapper, trapping fox, trapping raccoons, and then he would take these animals to fur buyers. In Michigan, they actually license people to be a fur buyer. You have to have a license to buy wild game for their pelts, for the fur. So they thought that was a good way to go undercover, is for Chuck to be a trapper, which then took him to taxidermists and fur buyers. Well, what Chuck learned was that the taxidermists and the fur buyers were doing a whole lot more than just stuffing animals or selling the furs.
So they were actually involved in the ring too?
They were involved in the ring too, because then the taxidermists and the fur buyers sold the meat.
Oh, okay.
To Thomas. So what looked like a legitimate transaction of buying fur was legitimate. The illegitimate part was the fact that out the back door, they were selling the carcasses. And so Thomas trapped fox, trapped raccoons. Those were the two primary things. Chuck grew a very heavy beard and became an outdoors person, a trapper. And so he went to one of the fur buying operations, had followed Tom to that fur buyer, and found a way to introduce himself to Tom. And Tom was impressed that Chuck had a pickup truck full of raccoons. And they struck up this conversation, and Tom started asking Chuck more questions about where did he get his raccoons, where did he get the fox, where did he get the various animals that he was trapping, and wanted to know if Chuck would sell some of those animals directly to him rather than to the fur buyers.
So Chuck B., the DNR officer, becomes a poacher to get into the poaching ring.
He didn't become a poacher because he was trapping at that time legally. Okay. You can trap in Michigan back then, and you can today. You can still trap animals in season. Okay. So he was very careful not to be in an entrapment situation where he would entrap somebody. So he was operating legally. But it was Tom that said, well, I would be more than willing to buy all the raccoons that you can bring in at any time. And I'd also be interested in big bunnies. And Chuck thought, what is he talking about? Well, what it turns out is big bunnies are white-tailed deer.
Oh, okay.
Rabbits are rabbits, but big bunnies are white-tailed deer. And Tom Huff said, I'd be more than happy to buy as many deer from you that you can get. And, I'll pay you as much as $50 a deer if you bring them to me. Chuck,
I gotta talk about, this is 1977, so $50 a deer. It's probably equivalent to what, $200 now?
It would be about $200 today. So Chuck said, yeah, I can provide that. So he gave Tom his phone number. Tom gave Chuck his phone number. And shortly thereafter, Chuck gets a call from Tom and Tom says, hey, meet me at the Meijer on Airport Road in Jackson, Michigan. I want to take you hunting. I want you to meet some people. So Chuck met in the parking lot at Meijer's down in Jackson. And Tom took him to meet a couple of other people that were working at Precision Products in Spring Arbor, which is just a little bit west of Jackson. And come to find out, there were a couple of people working there that were brothers. What we found out was they were some of the killers. In other words, the hunters, the ones that went out and hunted. So Chuck was taken by Tom to one of these people's houses. They arrived in the middle. It's in the middle of the country. It's a ramshackle-looking house. They go in, and Tom introduces his new buddy Chuck to the people in the house. One of the people look at Chuck, walk up to him, and say, "You look like you're the fucking conservation officer." And Chuck said, "What are you talking about? I'm not a conservation officer." Well, this guy had a hunting knife on his belt, and he had a .38 pistol in his belt. And he said, "If you're the fucking conservation officer, you're going to be a dead man." Yeah.
That's intense.
Chuck said, "I don't need this shit. I'm out of here." And turned around and started to walk out the house with no idea whether or not he was going to make it to the door. And the person that said that to him and accused him of being a conservation officer said, "Oh, no, stop. I just wanted to see how you'd react. Let's go hunting." Chuck had a Jeep. They all climbed into that. They drove out into the farm fields that had been harvested. And this is at night. And this is where Chuck discovered that one of the things that these hunters would do is they would take hard hats. They called them wheat hats. Where that name came from, I'm not sure. But they would literally mount a big flashlight on the hard hat, put it on, and use it to shine deer. And for those that are listening that don't know what shining deer is, if you're at night and there's a deer out there and you shine a flashlight in the deer's eyes, it freezes them. They won't move. So they're literally standing there, and somebody pulls out a rifle and shoots the deer.
Wow.
And that's what they did. And in fact, these people made sure that Chuck shot the first deer.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted to make sure that he would do something illegal.
Yeah, he's got to prove himself.
He's got to prove himself. That's right.
Okay, so he shoots the deer, and then what happens?
What they would do is they would work in teams where one person would drive, one person was in the passenger seat, two people were in the back, one with a gun, and one with a handheld flashlight, a lot of times, big spotlight type, if they weren't using the hard hats. And so one would be the shooter, one would be the spotter of the deer. They'd shoot a deer. The passenger would get out of the pickup truck, run out in the field, grab the deer, and haul it back to the truck and throw it in the back of the truck.
So they're just doing this from their vehicle, just driving out in fields and just doing this right from their vehicle.
Doing it right from the vehicles. A lot of times from the road. Right from the road. They're out on old country roads, unpaved country roads, paved country roads, middle of the night. That's what they were doing.
And the law enforcement never got involved because there's like midnight shootings in the country. No one ever called or...
Nobody ever calls. And so at that time they were deeply involved in this deer hunting operation. But what it grew into was they wanted to also get rabbits. Rabbits were a prime prize, if you would. And so what these hunters did was they told Chuck B, you need to get a ferret. Do you know what a ferret is? It's a weasel. It's a little weasel. A lot of people have them as pets. Well, what people don't know is that they are the best rabbit hunters there are. So you would get a ferret, you would take it to like a wood pile or someplace where there's a lot of rabbit dens. Ferrets, if you've never been around one, can smell terribly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they have the oil glands.
They do, but the rabbits smell them. So they take the ferrets, they put it into the wood pile or the rabbit dens, and literally the rabbits just flow out of there to get away from these ferrets. And the hunters stand there and shoot them as they come out. And it would not be at all unusual in a 20-minute time to get 30, 40 rabbits as this ferret is working its way through and scaring the rabbits out. So then they got into the rabbit harvesting, if you would. And it was interesting. Back then, they were selling deer for $50 a deer. They were selling rabbits for $2 a piece. They were selling ducks for $1.50 a piece. They were selling raccoons usually for about $1. But rabbits were really big, and they literally harvested thousands and thousands and thousands of rabbits over the years. And Tom, because he was working at Henry Ford Hospital, at night in the maintenance department, he had the run of the hospital a lot of the times. He would literally steal boxes of thousands of plastic bags from the hospital and would sell them to the hunters, the people that were getting the meat, and they would use those plastic bags to put the cleaned meat into and then put them in the freezer.
This guy, he had a racket going.
He had an absolute racket going. But at one point, he ended up going to another one of the hunters' houses where he met Paul. Paul was probably one of the meanest of the people that Chuck had to deal with. First time that Chuck met Paul was at Paul's house, and Paul was sitting in his truck. And of all things, he was eating sausages out of a tin can with a hunting knife. Chuck got into the truck and saw Paul with his hunting knife eating the sausages, and without any warning, Paul took the knife and literally put it at Chuck's throat and said, "You're the man, aren't you?"
Thank you for listening to part 1 of the Wildlife Mafia. Listen to part 2 to hear the mind-blowing conclusion to this epic story.